I'm Richard Chambers, the Senior Advisor for Risk and Audit at Audit Board, and welcome to another in my podcast series, Speaking of Risk and Audit, your go-to resource to help strengthen your organization's risk posture and add value across the three lines. I'm joined today by Tom McLeod. Tom is a highly sought-after Chief Risk Officer and Chief Audit Executive with more than 35 years of experience in empowering complex organizations to understand, manage, and assure risks. Tom and I have known each other a long time. He's currently serving as the Chief Risk Officer and Client Impact Officer for Yellow Canary. Tom, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate the time to have a chat.
No, it's always good to catch up. I know you and I caught up during the COVID year when I was doing a similar series to this when I was still at the IA, and I still recall how insightful the conversation was. And so it's a real delight to have you back in a podcast setting like this.
Thank you.
Now, Tom, I want to just give you a chance to tell our viewers and listeners what Yellow Canary is, what the company's about, and what your role is there.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to chat. The best way to position Yellow Canary is to position it around the two major questions that organisations have to address, or two major responsibilities. One, to keep their employees safe, and secondly is to pay them correctly. In Australia, the industrial relations environment is sufficiently complex, unnecessarily complex, many would say, that paying the employees correctly is not an easy task. Yellow Canary is the leading platform in Australia in terms of setting out essentially what, from an auditing perspective, we would call a reconciliation, a basic reconciliation between what should be paid and what actually is paid, and then identifying the root causes that come from behind that. My role there, as you rightly called out, is the Chief Risk and Client Impact Officer. The Chief Risk is looking at the risks internally and externally. The Client Impact Officer is talking about how the client or the customer sees the product and what it needs to do and what we need to do better. So it's, in summary, a great tool to be able to give confidence that you're addressing that question, are we paying our employees correctly? And we model ourselves on the journey of occupational health and safety, which over the last 30 years in the Western world, I think has done leaps and bounds in terms of how to manage risks. And that's how we model ourselves, and also understand what's moving forward with regards to pay compliance.
Well, you've been in this space, as I said in the intro there, for more than 30 years, and you've had some internal audit roles in the past. Any of them that come to mind that you'd like to point out?
Yeah, look, I've been very fortunate in the sense that I've moved across and deliberately moved across a whole variety of industries doing audit roles, whether it's been telecommunications, been manufacturing, whether it's been energy, whether it's been mining, even our national broadcaster, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And the reason why I say that it's been very fortunate in those roles, whether as Chief Auditor, is that I've been able to apply the principles of auditing more broadly than just in one domain and one industry. It's reminded me of the consistency of auditing and these auditing values across industries. It's reminded me of the jurisdictionally different approaches and understandings and respect for auditing. And mining company is a great example of that. When you have 50 different organisations under the banner of a mining conglomerate, you have the maturity of risk from extreme high level, what I often colloquially refer to as better than banks, to very, very basic understanding of risk. And it's really taught me and continues to teach me about how to make sure that you're managing risks and assuring risks in the way that is respectful and consistent with the organisation you're dealing with at that time, not the organisation you want to deal with at that time. Profoundly different experiences. I've loved my audit journey, and in part because it's kept me young. It's kept me eternally young, eternally curious. I've learned about how paper is made through to how iron ore is taken out of the ground. I've been into the nuclear power stations of Louisiana, right up to the pubs, as we call them in Australia, of some of the outback towns. And it's been magical to do it in between and continue to learn, as I said.
Sounds interesting. Sounds like you've had a fascinating career, and you're kind of like me. I think you're probably not ready to hang it up yet. You're going to continue to be a presence in our space for the foreseeable future. Tom, as I said, we've known each other for a long time. In fact, I was recalling as I was putting together some notes for today's podcast that I actually named you when I was still at the IA in 2019 as one of the top 10 thought leaders of the decade for our profession, for the looking back over the prior 10 years. And so it's really going to be fascinating to get your perspectives on where this profession is and where it's going. But Tom, you're like, I kind of refer to you as kind of like the E.F. Hutton of the internal audit profession. Those who are American will remember, and those who are older, like myself, remember the old E.F. Hutton commercials. They're a financial services firm. And the commercial basically was that if E.F. Hutton spoke up, everyone in the room stopped and put their hand to their ears to see what they were going to say. Well, for me, you're kind of like E.F. Hutton. And when you speak up, I take note. I listen to what you're going to have to say because it's often so insightful. And the thing that really strikes me is you're like the very first person I heard say anything about ChatGPT and some of the generative AI solutions that were rolling onto the market. And it was within literally a few days. I think back on over the years, and I can remember, where did I first hear Google? And where did I first hear ChatGPT? And I first heard ChatGPT from you. And you, even then, this was in late 2022, you were singing its praises and talking about the superpowers that this new solution was going to have. What tipped you off? How did you know? How did you realize how transformational this was going to become almost the moment that it was launched?
Yeah, thank you for the compliments. I think it was born out of realizing that loving the feeling of being a novice. To be honest, I've always been a great consumer of news and broadly of news, and so I was aware of artificial intelligence, but I always considered it within the domain of science fiction. Just if I may say so, one of the really interesting things is, have you noticed how we no longer talk about artificial intelligence as being in the domain of science fiction? So something happened there that tipped it over, and I'm going to say it was before ChatGPT. But I can clearly remember equally when I first came across ChatGPT, and I won't even pretend to hide the fact that I tried to do a poem as my first thing, and I truly expected something inconsequential to come back to me. And I typed it in, write a poem about how great I am, or something like that, and it wrote this laudatory poem. And I remember sitting there thinking, there must be someone on the other end that wrote this. But then I thought, no, actually, there can't be, because I got that back within a couple of seconds. And then I sat there and thought, oh, I must be very late to this. And the reason why I say that is that I was a doomsdayer with regards to the internet back in the mid 90s. I was very adamant that it wasn't going to change anything. And as a consequence, when I realized the folly of my ways a number of years later, I vowed I would never again be behind the curve in terms of exploring new products. So we could have had a similar conversation about the Second Life, if you recall that, 15 years ago, which was that online virtual world. I jumped into that and then realized there was no real positive application, despite the fact that you walked past the KPMG store and the McKinsey store. But I ultimately was struck by probably two or three moments over the last couple of years. One was obviously the launch of ChatGPT and the popularization of artificial intelligence. The second was speaking with my then 90-year-old mum about artificial intelligence and showing her ChatGPT. And mum was in an aged care home at the time, and mum realizing its potential. Mum was cognitively strong up until the day she passed. And mum said to me, wouldn't this be great if I could talk to this, and this could be the people in the nursing home, the aged care facility, could actually hear what I was saying, and then they could respond. And I'm sitting there thinking, my gosh, this is someone who is much before the computer age taking advantage of it. I also then heard a most fascinating comment early on that said that Uber gave us all personal drivers on demand, and so changed the very nature of driving, or very nature of chauffeuring or taxiing. And it struck me then that, well, if Uber could do that, what could this technology do? And so I let myself go free, go widely free. I deliberately shared it quickly because one, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep it to myself. That was just naive in the extreme. But I wanted to hear what other people were saying, and it very quickly came back into two camps. One was the This is not going to change everything. And there was if I may use the Australian phrase of bloody hell, this is going to change everything. But there was one final moment, if I can just say, just with regards to the one final moment to date, because there will be more, is the best way to describe it. It was when Notebook LM came out. And I remember sitting down and coming across it in a Wall Street Journal article of all things. And the headline was something along the lines of October last year. This podcast will become your favorite. And I'm a great podcast consumer. And I looked down and thought, well, what is he talking about? And he talked through this, and I wasted the rest of the day. The rest of the day, I didn't do a single thing. And this is the audio part of Notebook LM. I've tried as many different ways to use the technology to my betterment. And so we've all written the poem, we've all done the sonnet, we've all done then the summarize this. But now I'm trying to make it in a much broader capacity. Use Notebook LM for argument's sake. I take the GAO reports that come out and I get them summarized, not in and of themselves. They're interesting, that the Department of Defense hasn't done a system implementation right.
Right.
But what I then, if I got time, I go back and type in cybersecurity and I take out 10 reports on cybersecurity, put them into Notebook LM and ask it to tell me what has changed over the last 10 years in terms of the issues. And unfortunately, with something like cyber, when I did it, the LM came back and said, not a hell of a lot. And why that's teaching me is that I keep coming back to that. I love the feeling of being a novice. I love
Yeah.
the feeling of each day waking up. And so, in long answer to your short question, is why so quickly? Is because I had the courage to jump off the intellectual cliff, and that's something that's kept me in good stead throughout my whole career.
I think you served me up another mind-blowing moment when Notebook LM came out. I hadn't even heard of it, and I think if I'm correct, you took a blog that I wrote and posted one evening before I retired for the day, and you fed it into Notebook LM. And for those who don't know, Notebook LM has the ability to take sort of a written article and make a podcast kind of thing out of it. And I think you sent me the link to it, and I woke up the next morning and there's like two people having a podcast conversation about what I had written in the blog.
Yeah, and I can remember that very clearly. And it's interesting you said that you posted it and then went to bed, because that I'm waking up and just seeing it, and
Yeah,
I thought that because I've read a lot of what you've written over the years, I thought I would wanted to see how it could be interpreted or reinterpreted. And I remember just sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, this is revolutionary, because it's actually talking as if they had read it. They're
yeah,
talking about it in more broader sense, but jumping forward from that moment, it's about trying to understand more broadly where these things can take you. It's about understanding where's the boundaries of what you're comfortable with. And that's a good example. Hopefully, I didn't breach your intellectual property, but there would be a time, like the New York Times suing OpenAI, there is a time where we're going to come up with the boundaries of, intellectual property protection. And we have to be respectful of that,
yeah,
but we have to also understand that perhaps that was a framework that existed for a previous time.
yeah.
And I don't know where that's going to evolve. And I love watching it. And just to your point earlier about being in the profession for a lot more time, I feel the youngest I've ever felt in the profession to date. And for me, that's a weird thing to say after 35 years, but I feel enthused in a way that I haven't since the very first day someone asked me to audit accounts
Yeah.
receivable when I found my calling.
No, I think I'm the same way. I tell people that when I was 21 years old, I picked up my briefcase and I went off to an internal audit department, and I have from that moment on, I mean, like the old soul who went to internal audit at 21, I feel like I've lived my life in reverse, like Benjamin Button. And today, here I am at 70, and I work for a startup tech company that is revolutionizing the way GRC is practiced around the world. And so I feel exactly like you, and I'm having a chance to dabble in and play with all these new technologies. But you and I are kind of on one end of a spectrum. Here at Audit Board, we do an annual focus on the future survey to find out what's going on with the profession. And when we did it in the fall, we got some disappointing news in terms of adoption of AI by internal auditors. In fact, when we asked how many of you have significantly deployed AI, the numbers came back in the single digits. Now, this is 2 years after the so-called revolutionary events of ChatGPT and those other generative AI tools, and yet we're still seeing incredibly slow adoption by internal audit. Why is that, Tom? Why do you think the profession is procrastinating about embracing it more?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Firstly, I'd observe that my observations of other professions are that they're similarly slow to adapt. But I think in our profession, what we're dealing with is a profound change in our understanding of the nature of risk. And whether it's risk now being born of speed, being born of lack of source knowledge, so we don't know where the information is coming from or how it's otherwise articulated. So at its very core, I think it's procrastination is born out of fear. It's born out of a fear that, like you and I, we've invested our whole careers, and will we still be relevant in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years? And if we just hold on for another 5 years, well, that will get me through, and then I can go and do something else. So I think that fear and that fear is most pertinent in those who hold the purse strings and can invest in AI as a tool. When I speak to younger people, it sound old by just saying younger people. When I speak to younger people, I don't necessarily see that fear, but they don't hold the purse strings. I think that's one thing. I think that we've always been a profession that focuses on the now, and not to the sufferance of the mid to long term. And even looking at cybersecurity as an example, I think it was in the mid 70s that the GAO first wrote a report on cybersecurity. Don't hold me exactly to the date. So it's not a new phenomena in that regard, but yet I don't reckon that I use the phrase in an audit report until the late 90s. And so there is this very torturous process that one goes through. I think the procrastination is also born out of assurance. Independent assurance should be homogenous around the world. And I think that is deleterious to the adoption of new technologies, whatever they may be. And I think there's also a little bit of gun shy, which is strangely enough born out of the many false starts of data analytics. So, Rich, you and I are old enough and wise enough to have remembered the journey of data analytics, which was going to revolutionize everything in the mid 90s. And then it was going to revolutionize everything in the early 2000s, and then the mid 2005s. And then, so there's been a lot of false dawns. But ultimately, what I say to people about procrastination is that you're procrastinating on a concept that is at least 60 years old. And I just read just yesterday in preparation for our chat today, the phrase artificial intelligence was first used at a conference in Dartmouth in 1956. So we're not dealing with a new concept. We're dealing with a new application of an old concept. And Turing is obviously before that as well. So the procrastination is definitely around fear, but more relevant and more focused for us. I think that we're dealing with the profound reinterpretation of risk, and as a consequence, the profound reinterpretation of the assurance of that risk. And for me, that doesn't drive procrastination. It drives confusion, excitement,
Yeah.
uncertainty, joy, emotions that are very different to procrastination. And I've just got to manage my time so that I don't fall off into the pool of this information and not get anything else done.
If I look back over the 5 decades that I've been in the profession, I feel like internal audit is habitually late to every party when it comes to technology. I mean, in the 1980s, when desktops first started to be popularized and then later laptops, we were among the last to get them, at least in my internal audit function. When the internet came along, there was a sort of a little bit of reluctance to jump in and send emails and start taking full advantage of it. You move along in time. Cloud computing, we're a little bit late to, and in terms of recognizing the risk. And the same with cybersecurity, and now again with AI. Is it that internal auditors, I mean, we're trained almost from the earliest stages of our career that risk is bad, and that we need to always try and discourage risk taking, and that somehow that becomes ingrained in who we are? Is that an oversimplification, you think, and why we tend to be slow to adopt?
No, I don't think it's an oversimplification. I think it's at the very core of why we're slow to adopt. And I think that as a profession, we are ultimately a reactive profession. That the risk has happened or is going to happen. What should we do about it? Rather than if this risk happens in the future, the wargaming mentality never really visited assurance. And so as a consequence, I think that whatever the innovation might be. And I would not only throw in there IT innovation, I'd throw in there things like Six Sigma, and time and cost analysis and things like that,
Yeah.
that were profoundly driving process improvement. And yet we were somehow behind the eight ball in terms of adopting it. I think that at its very core, I think there is a lack of curiosity that has bedeviled the profession for a long time. I think it's also been a product of, again, the attempted homogenization of assurance globally. And so it's not, and I mean that not only jurisdictionally, but I mean it within industries as well. Uh, I think that doesn't help. I think that we talk ourselves as being partners, but we do that partnership by doing audits. An old boss of mine once said to me that the most effective piece of assurance I'll ever do is have a cup of tea 6 months before a system goes in. And I've never forgotten that because I like having, firstly, I like cup of teas, but I like having those moments where I can actually sit down with someone and say, look, if you don't have a steering committee on this project, probably in about 2 years' time, you're probably going to be answering to the board as to why there was cost overrun. So it's probably easier now to be on that steering committee. And inevitably you get the, can you be on my steering committee? Now, from an independence perspective, I can't be, but I would suggest X, Y, Z. They go away and get X, Y, Z. And so the risks that never happen, are the things that really resonate. The punch that Ali never gave Foreman, don't turn out to be the big moments. We focus on the punch that has landed. And use an example of whether it's the internet, cloud computing, or even the concepts of B2B and B2C. Um, I did whole audits without knowing what a B2B or B2C were, and I'm embarrassed to say that now. But I heard a wonderful description just a couple of days ago that we're going reverse order of the alphabet: B2B, B2C, B2B, and now we're at B2A, business to agent level. If we can see those things, I think that allows us to be able to say, we don't need to audit it just yet, but we need to do it at some time in the future, and we need to be thinking about it. I would have the naysayers. I would have that wonderful Apple ad of 10, 15 years ago about the only people that ever changed the world are the people that had the ideas to be brave. I would have a wide school of community of people talking. I would have the African and the Asian and the South American and the North American and the European and the Australian and everywhere in between, and the Middle Eastern views on an issue. I would have vigorous debates, and then someone may sit back and say, this is a load of rubbish, or alternatively, someone may take a nugget and run with it. And then all of a sudden, we are not behind the eight ball anymore. But it's not just IT innovation, it's innovation as a whole. That is what I'd call out.
So Tom, there's a kind of a little bit of a debate that continues to go on about whether AI is an existential threat to internal audit or the internal audit profession. I've sort of, my thinking has evolved about this, but I'm curious what your thinking is. Do you see it as this is something that can essentially replace what we've traditionally done?
Yes, with a caveat. I see it as the greatest existential risk to the profession of internal audit since the invention of the abacus, to be honest. And the reason why I say that isn't to be dark and menacing. It's more so as a case of, if all information is digital, then the analysis of all information that is digital in an AI world is not 1,000 times, but 1,000,000 times quicker than what a human could do. So it obviously replaces that. I also think it's our greatest opportunity. We are literally, over the next couple of years, at that moment, the tipping point, for the want of a better phrase, where the profession could die the way of, respectfully, bookkeepers have diminished over the years, or alternatively, could become so central to things. And the reason why I call that out is probably, going back a little bit to the Uber example I used before, but now everyone has access to a world-class specialist doctor through artificial intelligence. Everyone has access to a personal tutor. Where we are at that stage, although it's not yet popularized, everyone has access to a world-class risk advisor as well. And we need to be riding that wave. So yes, it's a huge threat, but I'm going to turn it into a huge opportunity. Um, and this is going to sound a little bit glib, it's not meant to be, but we have one of the great branding opportunities of all time, of any profession. We have the initials already there. IA flipped on its head is AI. Internal audit, which I've always thought is a little bit myopic in terms of its phrasing because it narrows it down rather than makes it broader. If we turned internal audit into the IA, into AI, and called it auditing intelligence, and I know this sounds like it's being flippant, but that changes everything. It changes everything how we approach it, or assuring intelligence. I don't know what that A necessarily stands for, and I'm not trying to copy Apple intelligence as much, but reinventing our mission, reinventing our understanding. Now, whether it's Audit Board, whether it's Yellow Canary, whether it's some startup that we haven't even heard of at the moment, there is this opportunity for us to really take it. Because in my dream, if we were to do a review of cybersecurity, for argument's sake, in an organization, if you were internal auditing that cybersecurity, you're looking at segregation of duties, you're looking at access rights and the like, and they're of course relevant and appropriate. And you're looking at your internal logs. Auditing intelligence for me is looking at cybersecurity and comparing every single bank's public statements for the last 40 years and positioning our understanding of risk against that statement, and then our understanding of assurance thereof. And in time, in the same way that we all share crime statistics these days, I envisage a world where there will be certain elements of business that have to be publicly declared. Now, that will be a great challenge to get through any Congress. It will be a great challenge to get through any Parliament. But I think that it'll get to that point, like occupational health and safety, where we have to drive it. So yes, it is an existential threat, but it's a bloody big opportunity. For argument's sake, and I know there will be many people listening to this that will be at the international conference for the Institute of Internal Auditors mid-year. I would, whatever that agenda is, I would throw it out and solely focus on 30 different iterations of the existential threat issue for internal audit. I would have the evangelists, the extreme evangelists, and I would have the doomsayers. I would have the product presenters and the dreamers. I would have the academics and the students all saying this is how it could be seen. My respectful challenge to anyone that's listening to this is that if we don't change in 5 years, but the world around us has, that is the definition of redundancy. In the same way that people can still use abacuses, that's great. They still actually compute accurately, but they're no longer useful.
Yeah. Well, if I could, I would speak about this topic with you all day, because I think there's going to be plenty of tremendous insights that'll come from that. But unfortunately, we kind of got to bring it to a close here. And I guess I would ask you, as a parting thought, if you were going to be coaching a chief audit executive out there who's not been an early adopter, and who's still sitting on the fence about how much they should be pushing their staff or their team to embrace AI, what coachable advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I'm going to break it down into two. One is the practical and one is the aspirational. The practical, I would say to them, do an audit, do a review of how AI agent ready you are within your business. And of course, it won't be as good and you'll be embarrassed about that audit in 3 years' time. But by doing that audit, you become part of the conversation, not an adjunct to it. So it allows you to see it in real time, will add value to the organization. If you turn around and say our processes are not agentic ready, then that's going to actually allow for process improvement. and then equally allows you to understand from an agent perspective where you can do things better from an audit perspective. So that's the advice I've been giving people, is just do a review in this space. We learn a lot about the areas. Go back to cybersecurity. I've learned everything about cybersecurity from doing 50 reviews over the years, and the like. But more philosophically, I'm going to call out that you need to approach it with curiosity. So you need to be surfing the waves of poorly named new models that come out and everything like that, so that you understand what's actually happening. You need to understand, we're talking today, a day after Elon Musk put in an Australian $155 billion bid for OpenAI. You need to understand the ramifications of that, and that it might just be two egos clashing in the stratosphere. You need to be uncomfortable. The greatest growth that I've ever had as an auditor is when I'm uncomfortable. And I don't just say that around technology. It's when I've sat before audit committees, and audit committees have pushed me to the boundaries of what I don't know. It's when I've sat with the people from the profession like yourself, Richard, and all of a sudden a new viewpoint has been presented to me. And I do actually it is. Oh yeah. Okay, I might adopt that as my own. I'll go through that whole thinking process.
Right.
And then I think the last thing I'd actually encourage people to do is debate. Can I finish with one observation? There was a wonderful letter to the editor in the London Times probably about 4 years ago. And the person wrote, "Dear Sir," as they always write in those letters to the editor, "I read your opinion page yesterday, and I completely disagreed with everything that was on it." Next sentence was, "Please keep up the good work." And I always thought that was a wonderful capture of what we should be doing about being curious. That's what I've tried to drive. It's what's making me feel much younger again. It's what's probably going to drive the next 20 years of my career. It's probably what's going to drive me annoying 90% of the people, but inspiring 10%. So onwards and upwards with regards to the journey, but I can't see where it's going to end, but what a journey it will be.
Well, thank you, Tom McLeod. And I think it goes without saying that you inspire far more than you annoy. Thank you for joining me, being a part of the discussion, and I'll look forward to having you back another time.
Thanks,
I'm,
Richard.
uh,
I
yeah,
appreciate it.
for Audit Board, I'm Richard Chambers, Senior Advisor, Risk and Audit.